Standing in for Ed Fitzgerald, our president today. Rex Smith is our speaker. He's going to talk about essential journalism in challenging times.
You said that.
I did. I did. I wanted to be sure everybody was listening. Now, we do have one change to the program. Next week, Dr. Kenzenko was going to talk, but that's got switched to a later date. Dr. Kevin Newth is going to come in, associate professor of physics at the University of Albany. He's going to talk about the science of UAPs. And for those of you who don't know, that's the new word for UFOs. So again, an appropriate topic. What we know and what we are learning. So that should be very interesting. So that'll be next week. It originally was scheduled for April 10th, but he's going to come in next week. And I'll turn it over to Dean Napton, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks. You said next week. You mean
I'm sorry.
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
February 27th. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for coming in today. I know it was a challenge because it's a nice day out there. I swear the birds were singing spring this morning. So thanks for being here. Rex Smith has been a leading New York State journalist for 4 decades. He writes and publishes the Upstate American, a weekly analysis of news and society, and is the host of a long-running public radio program called The Media Project. Rex spent 25 years with Hearst, including 18 years as the editor of the Times-Union, the newspaper of New York's capital region. This led to state and national recognition for reporting, writing, photography, and design, both in print and on digital platforms. Rex was awarded a master's degree with highest honors by Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. He now chairs the Illinois board there. He holds an undergraduate degree cum laude from Trinity University in San Antonio. A lifelong musician, Rex now performs with Albany Pro Musica, one of the Northeast's premier chorale ensembles, and he currently serves as board president. He and his wife, the author Marion Roach Smith, live in Rensselaer County, New York. That's where I am. Their daughter, Grace Yu Ying Smith, is an official of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Rex.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to join you. I suspect this is a group where I don't need to mention that there comes a point in your life when there are fewer invitations for people to ask you to talk to them. We will go for a little while. I'll talk for a little while, but principally, I think your questions will be where we'll get into the most interesting material. And you may have questions on a variety of things. I don't plan to talk much about choral performance, but we could talk about that if you like. Dave and I sing together in Albany Pro Musica. We can do some more of that, and we can talk more about the topics that whatever may drive your interest. But I'm going to talk some about truth telling and about the fundamental role that I think that journalism needs to play in a society, and why we are facing so many challenges in that today, and what peril I think that presents to a democratic society. Just some kind of big topics at hand there, but I think that's sort of where I'm coming from in my professional experience. Let me just make sure that I'm in the picture here. And that's where I need to be. You know, I have to tell you that when I became the editor of the Times-Union in 2002, it was a wonderful moment for me. It was a job that I had aspired to, actually. I came up to this community in 1987. I was a political writer for Newsday, the very ambitious downstate newspaper that in those days said nobody has better state government coverage than we do. And I was assigned to cover Mario Cuomo's presidential race. He didn't run, of course. So it sort of could have cast a damper on my career. I became the state capitol bureau chief and did that for a few years. And my wife, who's from New York City, said, you know, we could have a good life here. Let's see if we can figure out a way to stay. And as I would come into the airport, I would see that big building out at the end of Wolf Road and think, I'd like to be the editor of this newspaper. Well, Harry Rosenfeld already was. So I became the editor of the paper in Troy, the Troy Record, for 4 years. It was kind of like editor training school. And then the managing editor, the #2 newsroom job at the Times Union for 7 years. And then I became the editor. And I have to say, 2002, the year I became the editor, was the best year in the history of the Times Union in terms of its financial performance. And it was all downhill throughout my editorship. Sad to say that, but I thought that it was a big job, an important job. And that was true in the 19th century, actually, or even earlier in the 20th. But let me tell you how important the job was. Let me tell you what Napoleon said. Napoleon, one of the great military minds, who during his lifetime, a third of the Western world was under his sole control. Napoleon said, "A journalist is a grumbler, a censurer, a giver of advice, a regent of sovereigns, a tutor of nations." He said, "4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets." I like that. Well, we don't fight with bayonets anymore. Newspapers are not what they once were. And I came to appreciate that more and more as time went on in my editorship. As we made the transition from print into digital, now my successor, Casey Seiler, runs an operation that is principally digital. We still call it a newspaper, but paper is really almost an afterthought. The newspaper isn't even laid out here anymore. It's laid out at a center in Connecticut. It's printed here, and the Times Union prints newspapers from throughout the region. But there isn't even a staff. I used to sit down with a pencil and a sketch pad and sketch the front page every day. And that is such an anachronism. But it's not only that we have changed in the sense of it being a digital operation first and foremost, instead of a print operation. It is also diminished because of the impact of the digital revolution on the business model that has been underlying American journalism throughout most of its history. That business model being advertising supports the enterprise. Advertising that comes because of circulation. If you sell 100,000 newspapers and you want to reach those 100,000 or 250,000 people, if each newspaper is passed on to somebody else, well, it used to be that you had to buy an ad in the newspaper to reach those people in this community. And now, of course, you don't. If we want to find out something, we use the Google machine. And it's really much more efficient than newspaper advertising. So advertising has declined as the underpinning of the information ecosystem. And at the same time, of course, there's been an assault on the credibility of the media, a conscious, intentional assault waged for political gain. That has undermined the notion of the credibility of the media in the minds of a huge proportion of the American population, even as we know from public opinion surveys, Americans have lost faith in all manner of institutions, military, churches, even the post office has fallen in stature in the minds of Americans. And of course, the media has as well. Perhaps we rank only slightly above members of Congress in that regard, but they're working on us. And this has led to a significant decline in journalism. In 2008, which would be about a third of the way through my time as editor, it was a good time in 2008, but by that time, there already had been a diminution. There were about 114,000 newsroom jobs in America. That is newspapers and television and a few in radio still. There's almost no news on radio anymore. And digital operation, 114,000 jobs. That's now, as of right now, probably about 75,000. That's about 1/3 of journalism jobs then disappeared over the last 15 years. 1/3 of journalism jobs disappeared. And I will tell you that while automation can do some things, and pretty soon it will steer your car, it cannot go out and gather news the way a newspaper reporter can. It cannot analyze data with a sense of understanding that a human brings to it. In fact, since and the result has been that there's been a decline of newspapers as well, of those newsrooms across the country. Since 2005, the US has lost about a fourth. No, let me turn it the other way around. Since 2005, we've lost about a fourth of the newspapers that were operating then. And probably by 2025, that is during that 20-year span, we will probably have lost about a third of the newspapers that were operating in America just those 17 years ago. We remember 2005. It doesn't seem that long ago. I think it was the year before last. And during the pandemic, in fact, alone, 360 US newspapers closed. Now, a lot of those were weekly newspapers covering small communities. A lot of dailies went out of existence too. But what is the phenomenon in dailies? And this is a very sensitive topic for those of us who I spent my entire careers in dailies, from an internship at my hometown paper, the Rapid City Journal in Rapid City, South Dakota, to my first newspaper job in Northwestern Indiana at the Rensselaer Republican. That's how we said it in the Midwest, Rensselaer. Here we say Rensselaer, same family, by the way. The difficulty is that in these small dailies, a lot of them are now ghost newspapers where there is barely a staff to keep them alive. In the early 90s, I was the editor of the paper in Troy, the Record, from 1991 to 95. I was the editor of the Troy Record. And at that time, I had 38 people in the newsroom, reporters and photographers and a couple of editorial assistants and sports reporters and clerks and copy editors and about 11 reporters. And there are now, for the Record, there are 4 people. The entire newsroom staff is 4. That's editors and reporters and photographers to put out that little newspaper. It's now printed by the Times Union, of course, as well as the Saratogian and the Daily Freeman of Kingston and, well, anyway, many others. So the difficulty of that is that these daily newspapers that still exist really cover only a tiny proportion of the news that goes on in their communities. They simply cannot do the accountability reporting, the investigative and watchdog reporting that's fundamental. 70 million Americans live in counties where there is no newspaper at all. No newspaper at all. And many others are barely served by these ghost newspapers. The Poughkeepsie Journal used to be a wonderful newspaper about the size of the Troy paper. The Glens Falls Post-Star, those are papers that barely have a staff. They don't have editors anymore, you know. My good friend Stu Shinsky used to be the editor of the Poughkeepsie Journal. Ken Tingley, the editor of the Glens Falls Post-Star. When they left their jobs, they were not replaced. The editors of those papers live somewhere else. They don't do the same job as what the editors of those newspapers did. There's almost no news coverage being done there. Now, what happens when there's no local journalism? You know, when we hear these politicians talk about the lying press and the mainstream media, and when they induce people attending their campaign rallies to stand up and turn around and boo the reporters. Well, they're booing the National Press Corps. You know, I've been a part of that. I covered the presidential race in 1988, and I know that you're part of this big phalanx of reporters, and you feel somewhat secure in that. You feel like, well, we're the big mighty press, we're good. But let me tell you where the fundamental problem is at the local level, where the stories are not being done. You know, it's not just that there is no watching of local officials, it's that there is a result of that. I'll give you a great example. A friend of mine, a guy named Jeff Gottlieb, who was actually a classmate of mine at Columbia, won a Pulitzer Prize with the LA Times for reporting on a little town of Day, California. His reporting, this would have been about 10 years ago, found that Day, California, was paying its little community of about 60,000 people, was paying its city council members $125,000 a year and was paying its mayor $450,000 a year and its city manager $680,000 a year. They were all, it was a bunch of pals, all these guys, and they kept voting themselves big raises. And so that they had millions and millions of dollars going out to this government that did very little, because the little town of Day was not actually doing much governing, but these people were getting paid huge amounts. And my buddy Jeff Gottlieb was a veteran reporter, a young local, a sort of beginning reporter, found this story, and the LA Times brought in another reporter at a bigger newsroom. Is what you do. You team up a veteran reporter with the young person, you strengthen the young person's skills, and you make sure there's somebody kind of watching over them, and you put two hands on the story, and so it makes it quicker to develop. So this is why you see multiple bylines in a lot of the bigger newspapers. So my buddy Jeff got put on this story, and they uncovered and documented this fraud that was being perpetrated upon the citizens, and blew it up, and they won a Pulitzer Prize for it, Pulitzer Prize for local reporting. And it's good stuff. I've been a juror for the Pulitzer Prizes. I know that this kind of reporting is fundamental to what is really about American journalism. But here's what's ironic and actually tragic about this. That perversion of taxpayer trust, that waste of funds, would not have happened if the LA Times hadn't abandoned covering that community from the get-go. You know, if they had been covering the city council the way the newspapers used to, covering local government the way I did when I was a beginning reporter down on Long Island in the early 1980s, if that kind of local coverage had existed, there wouldn't have been the fraud in the first place. My pal Jeff wouldn't have won his Pulitzer Prize, because there would have been no corruption to do that. In fact, research finds that there is a higher likelihood of higher taxes where there is no local journalism. Reporting actually reduces your tax bill. That's because there's somebody watching over. And you know this is true because they just, nobody wants to have the headline in the paper, tax bill rises by 10%, or it's actually usually more subtle than that. There's a reassessment that leads to taxes changing, but in any case, this is what's true, that dollars are wasted when journalism dies. But it's more than that, What happens is the fabric of the community is frayed when there is nobody giving voice to what is really the lifeblood of the community, to what's going on. Now, in the little paper in Indiana that I was the editor of, when through magical circumstances, I became the editor of this little 3,800 circulation daily when I was all of 21 years old. I had been an intern when I was after my junior year in college, and the editor that the publisher hired didn't work out. The publisher's son was the editor. He died. They hired a replacement. Didn't work out. And so he asked me to come back and be his editor. And I was 21. I was so excited. I skipped my college commencement. I drove to Indiana and took up this post. And they said I was the only guy in town who wore a tie. But it was, but here's the thing you find out about that. It's not only that you're covering the local county board and the hospital board and the city council and the police activities. Yes, there is all of that, and it was exhausting, and it was thrilling as well. But it's also that you're covering what's going on in the community. You're covering who the youngster who has the grand champion pig and the reserve champion at the county fair in the 4-H competition. You're writing a story about the elderly lady who bakes pies for the little cafe downtown, who makes the best pies. These are real stories I wrote. You're writing even about the Little League champions. One summer, I remember I went out to take a picture of every Little League team in Rensselaer, Indiana, little county seat town of 5,000. And, here all these, it was all boys at that time. There might have been a girl. Anyway, it was, and here they were, these, little guys there, taking a knee, looking like major leaguers in training. It was a great thing to do. And it made me feel good to put their pictures in the newspaper every day. By the way, if you ever have to shoot a picture of a pig, Bear in mind that they tend to be shy. Because if you want to shoot the picture of the pig's snout. So you go to where the pig is and he goes like this. And he turns around. You think, well, I don't want to shoot the rump of the pig. And so you go around to where his snout is, and he turns around on you again. He doesn't want to let you see his face. So you kind of have to sneak up on the pig if you want a good picture of a pig. The things that you learn in journalism, it's important. This is the kind of thing, this is what stitches people together. This is one of the reasons why people mistrust journalists on the national scale. It's one of the reasons why there is resonance. There are other reasons that we can concede errors in print, which are really terrible things. But one of the reasons that the criticism of the press is so resonant is because people don't have neighbors going into their local newspaper anymore. You don't have a reporter as your next door neighbor or an editor down the road because those organizations no longer exist. There are, the guy who passed the offering plate in the church I grew up in was Vern Shepherd. He was a local radio voice that I heard every morning. He was a celebrity to me. These people are no longer a part of our lives because local journalism is dying. And this is a tragedy, and I should say at the same time, let's go back to that issue of the political assault, which has real resonance, particularly for partisans of the politicians who really engage in it. Now, there is a question about that people will rightly raise. I'm trying to think of how best to phrase this, about bias in the media, because people will tell you, well, the reason why people distrust the press is because it's biased. And what people generally mean is because they report things that don't align with my point of view. You all, I'm sure, have all engaged in research. And so you will understand that there are tools, there is research that tries to identify where bias resides. And there are actually scholars of communication who have tried to identify receptor bias, that is the bias on the part of newspaper readers by comparison to the bias on the part of the message itself. And the finding over and over again, repeated by various types of methodologies of research, is that there is more bias on the part of those who receive the information than there is on the part of those who convey it. Notwithstanding that, the difficulty becomes where the charge of journalism is. That is, what is it that journalists are supposed to be doing? And this has arisen in part as journalists have come to realize that their job is not merely to give people what happened, but to give people the truth. In fact, when the Society of Professional Journalists, the national organization of journalists, which also includes a student branch, people tend to become members of SPJ as students, and then they join the ranks of the professionals. When they set out about 20 years ago to write a code of ethics, what emerged were 4 major tenets. And I had them painted on the wall of the major conference room at the Times Union so that we could look at them every day as we sat there around the big conference table to put the newspaper together. And the most important one is the first. The first rule says, seek the truth and report it as fully as possible. Now, reporting as fully as possible is hard because people have limited attention spans. And so you can't just write everything you know, or you lose people. And part of your responsibility is to make your work digestible so that people will be able to absorb it, so that you're not just writing for yourself, which is a problem that a lot of journalists engage in, or writing for your sources because you want to show them how much you know things, but you're writing for the general public. So report it as fully as possible. It means get what you can in time for your deadline, report only what you know, but make it available and report it as fully as possible. But the first part, seek the truth. And the truth is not always represented by facts. Here's my favorite example, actually. When George Pataki was elected governor of New York, maybe some of you were around at that time, George Pataki promised, actually his phrase was real fundamental sweeping change. That became his mantra, so much so that it became kind of a joke among the reporters, real fundamental sweeping change. And, he's a mild-mannered guy, nice guy, George Pataki. He's not a fire-breathing guy, not the sort you real fundamental sweeping change, but he's a good guy. But anyway, after he'd been governor for about 9 months, in September of, let's see, what year would that have been? That'd have been about 92. He was elected in 92, so that would have been September 93. He went up to speak to the annual meeting of the Business Council of New York State at the Sagamore at Lake George. It's a wonderful 3-day meeting. The business leaders play golf and hang out and talk about things. I was asked to come moderate a panel, so I was there for their opening banquet where the governor came to speak. And Governor Pataki got up and announced that he had turned around the economy of New York State. And you remember he was a tall guy, and I remember him sweeping out his arms like this. I thought he looked like nothing so much as Big Bird getting ready to take off. He said, what a turnaround, what a story. And I thought, well, it would be quite a story if it's true. New York State at the time was the 5th largest economy in the world, standing by itself. And to turn around the 5th largest economy of the world, well, that takes a big rudder to be able to turn a ship that big, that fast. But the reporter who was up there for the Times Union, there was a business reporter covering it, and he reported that what a turnaround, what a story the governor said. That was the fact. That's what he said. But I thought we ought to look into that. Well, at the time I was the managing editor. I wasn't the top editor of the Times Union. I was number 2 in the newsroom, and my boss, the editor, who became later left and went on to another job, he didn't like the idea of doing the story. I thought we should look at, did he really turn around the economy of New York State? By the time we ended up doing the story, we were a little more than 2 years. We had 2 years of data. We waited, and I finally got my way. And 2.5 years into the Pataki administration, so that would have been about 18 months after he said that, we produced a story that looked at the economy of New York State. And we set out to do it really methodically. We went to 3 different econometric consulting firms to find out what indices they would use to measure the economy of New York State. Non-farm employment, real estate starts, even auto sales. I think there were 7 different metrics that we applied to determine how healthy was, in fact, the economy of New York State. And we found, after 2 years of data in hand, that on 5 of the 7 metrics, the economy was actually performing better under Mario Cuomo than it was under George Pataki. Now, there are many reasons why an economy moves. A governor doesn't really move an economy, but he bragged that he had. And so in the interest of truth telling, we thought if our mission is to seek the truth and report it as fully as possible, our job was to tell the truth. But the difficulty is, it was also true that the governor had said that. But which do you think is the challenge, is the right course of journalism? To report what the governor says, even if it's not true, or to report to our readers what is true, even if what the governor said was not? And here's where we run into a lot of the conflict of journalists nowadays, because we live in a society that values truth less than it used to. And we live in a society where our elected officials care a lot less about telling the truth than they used to, and where we don't hold them accountable for it. And therefore, we are actually in what I would call a spreading pandemic of the misinformation disorder, because we are at a place where we don't have really a good record of assessing what is true and what is not. More than 1/4 of Americans these days, and 60% of those who say they're Republicans, believe the lie of Donald Trump that he that he was cheated out of re-election. There is no doubt, and I will tell you this as a journalist, and every respectable news organization puts it this way, that is a lie by Donald Trump. There has been no evidence to support Donald Trump's claim that he actually was cheated out of the presidency. But a quarter of Americans believe it because he has told them this, and because the confidence in the media has eroded so that they don't believe anybody who discounts what he has to say. They still believe what he says. And he is supported, of course, by a majority of the members of his party in Congress. So the lie is sustained by more liars. I'm sorry, that sounds like political bias, but I'm speaking the truth to you. And that's where journalism gets into trouble, because the truth runs up against partisan misinformation. You know, this is not new, by the way. Benjamin Franklin published fake news under pseudonyms. Benjamin Franklin claimed, the existence of a publication when he was in France as the American ambassador. He sent back dispatches to the United States claiming under a fake label of a newspaper that did not exist certain information. There are many examples of it. He used 100 different pseudonyms, let's say, to shield that what he was writing. The difference now is that fake news reaches people instantaneously and has tremendous impact. And it reaches millions of people who, under Supreme Court rulings, are all allowed to carry guns freely. So it's a dangerous situation. So it's not that misinformation is spread only by politicians, but it is not stopped by politicians. We now have the House Select Subcommittee on Weaponization of the Federal Government that is trying to show how the federal government supposedly weaponized its power. The subcommittee in itself is a weaponization of the power of the Congress. I mean, this is, I'm sorry if the term Orwellian were not overused. Mr. Orwell would be shocked to see how prescient he was. And so we live in a place where we are challenged constantly. We as citizens live in a country where the challenge is to try to figure out, how do we deal with this situation? About a little more than a year ago, the Aspen Institute issued a report, a result of a year-long probe by a sort of blue-collar group. The most prominent person on it was Katie Couric, the former news anchor, and they issued a report on the impact of what it called a world disordered by lies, a world disordered by lies. And that is truly what we have. And the difficulty is trying to figure out how we get out of this. How do we turn that around in an environment where, we're moving into the era of artificial intelligence, where we're going to find it very difficult to decipher what is real from what is not. Now, I know that actually University of Albany is one of the places where there is some terrific research being done on the ways to delineate, to differentiate and find truthful images from those that are fake. I had a wonderful presentation. It was during the years that George Phillips was the president. And I remember getting a briefing on the laboratory where there were really significant efforts to be able to identify photography that had been altered from that which is genuine. But AI is going to get ahead of us, is probably already ahead of us. It's probably going to be very difficult. And we are probably, within 10 or 15 years, we will probably have AI generated news anchors, not real people, delivering news to us. We will not be able to tell that it's not a real person. We will not be able to tell if the information is true. This is quite a challenge in a free society. we're going to our heirs. We may not be here for all of this, but our heirs are going to have to figure out how to deal with this, because the freedom that we have assumed is fundamental to our existence. The free exchange of ideas is skewed when there isn't a respect for honesty that underlies the operation of the government. Democracy hinges upon the informed electorate, but if the electorate is not given an opportunity to be able to get real information, if we are presented a rather steady diet that is as harmful to us, to our intellect, as a diet of potato chips and Coca-Cola would be for our physical bodies, we will have our democracy will decay as surely as our human bodies would under that kind of a biological diet. So there are, I think, some potential solutions, though I think we don't really know how to deal with some of these challenges. There are, for example, on the less macro of these challenges, the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, that would provide tax credits for hiring in local newsrooms. That makes sense. We use the tax code all the time to stimulate the kind of activity that we as citizens want to encourage. That's why we allow tax breaks for donations to not-for-profit organizations. I'm the board chair of Albany for Musica, and I invite you to donate to the sustaining of good music in our community. It's tax deductible. I just heard Alan Shar talk on the radio, trying to get people to give their tax deductible contributions to public radio. That's great. And so there is a history of this kind of, let's say, taxpayer support of not-for-profits, taxpayer engagement in activities that we support. And I would submit that sustaining local journalism is pretty essential to the fabric of our democracy, and we ought to encourage that. I think there ought to be something done about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1994. Section 230 is what allows major tech platforms like Google and Facebook and Twitter to avoid liability for what they publish. If as the editor of the Times Union, if I intentionally and with malice aforethought or with reckless disregard for the truth, if I published a lie that was damaging to someone, well, that's considered libel, and I'm liable for it. I could be sued, and every editor, every publisher knows that. Well, and that's a good thing. There ought to be a certain standard that if you intentionally harm someone or through your gross professional recklessness harm someone, you should be held to account for that. That is not the way that Facebook and Google and Twitter operate, because they claim to be technology platforms. And under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1994, which is, the dark ages of the internet, that is so that ought to be examined. Perhaps lift that liability exemption in exchange for the disclosure of their moderation standards, say. So what do you do to moderate the content, or some sort of transparency of the origination of their content? These are difficult issues because they seem to fly in the face of our First Amendment freedom in some cases. But we have gotten to a point of such difficulty that we have to step up, such peril, I think, that we have to step up and take on some of these challenges and figure out what might work. Now, I don't know if we've gone, maybe my daughter's an optimist. She's 28 years old. And she believes that what we have witnessed in the terrible political situation may be the death rattle of that type of politics, that maybe something great will rise from this. And I hope she's right. I really love her confidence and her courage. And maybe that's so. And I think that in any case, we have to sustain ourselves. We have to keep on, I began with the quotation of Napoleon, the good old days when editors could wield bayonets. And I will just leave you with a thought of Robert Frost. And I remember John Kennedy's inauguration. Robert Frost stood there in the bright sunlight and near his death and delivered a poem. And Robert Frost said, "Courage is the human virtue that counts most. Courage to act on limited knowledge and insufficient evidence. That's all any of us have. And if we have limited knowledge and we have insufficient evidence, but that's all we have to act upon. And it just takes our courage to step forward and move forward. And I think that's where we are at this point. I've talked longer than I intended. I would be very happy to take your questions. Thank you. Oh, yeah.
When you talk about what I believe is called opinion journal, you talk how I believe it's called opinion journalists and journalism.
Yeah.
Fits into this.
Yeah, I am now an opinion journalist. So I've left the Times Union. I write a weekly column published by Substack. It's called The Upstate American. You can subscribe for free or you can pay $50 a year. It's up to you. Just www.upstateamerican.com. That's my commercial. And I write my opinion. I footnote what I write. I let people know the sources of my research. It's like my model is sort of Heather Cox Richardson, right? Who's a history professor, specialist in Civil War history is she at Boston University, I believe? She does this, not specific footnotes, but she has, it's you would appreciate it academically. So I think opinion journalism is important and useful. There's a difference, however, between the guy on the next bar stool just telling you what he thinks and an opinion journalist who is tethered to data. In fact, I teach opinion writing. My wife has a digital writing clinic that she runs. It's called the Memoir Project, and she has clients all over hundreds of them all over the country and all over the world, actually. And so I work for her, and once a month we teach a course on how to write the op-ed, the radio essay, the digital essay. And I tell them that if you want to be anything other than like the next dope on talk radio or the guy sitting next to you in the bar stool, same value, you need to back up what you say with data, information, and reveal your sources. And so I think there is nothing wrong with opinion journalism, with people offering their points of view, but I think that there's a responsibility to not just make up stuff and to give people the benefit of showing them your credibility ought to hinge on your scholarship, frankly. I mean, whether you have actually done anything or you're reporting, it would be in my world. What have you found that backs this up? Now, it's not that you can't have, we all know about data that's not what it seems and sources who aren't as good as they purport to be. But I think that I'm not saying there's not a place for opinion. It's just that I respect opinion journalism that has a certain respect for real information, not just something that I made up because it's convenient and it's what my daddy told me to believe. So I think that's the difference I see. Yeah. Yep.
Notice you said you have a Substack
Yeah.
page. I had a friend of mine who was kind of controversial. In fact, he was a candidate for governor, Libertarian Party.
Huh.
And he threw a lot of questions on a lot of commentary of the way media worked in our society. And he got banned in Facebook, he was censored. Now, have you ever been banned or had a comment been told to remove?
No.
Or now, to me, it's almost a badge of honor. That if you can tell me, yes, I did one thing that pissed off the censors. To me, that lends a credibility, I guess. But I guess my question is more along the lines of when you talk about, see, big difference. I'm an atmospheric scientist, and
Uh-huh.
everything I publish goes through peer review.
Aha.
And I
Right.
remember one time getting interviewed by a local reporter. And I said, could I read what you're writing about here? It was an article related to global warming and some of the things like that. And he said, no.
Yeah. What year
Now,
was that, by the way?
I
How
guess-
long ago was that?
Oh, that was 15
Yeah,
years
because the
ago.
standard's a little different now.
Well,
That's
I
good.
guess what I'm saying.
It's an
is
interesting point.
I would be curious to
Yeah.
know your opinion on the value of peer review.
Yeah.
It's what you're gonna write.
Yeah.
At a minimum, I can maybe give you, or you should even give it to your enemies to let them read it.
Yeah.
And then, but anyway, can you comment on peer review? And what I thought was interesting was the lack of peer review.
Yeah.
I think maybe, I don't know,
Mhm.
I guess maybe science and the peer review process can
Yeah.
maybe contribute.
Right. It's interesting, that your experience is what used to be the norm, probably still is the norm. Journalists say, no, you can't review it, but there is increasingly for the last 10 years, say, maybe even a little bit more, there's been a move in journalism to increasingly do not what that reporter did, but instead say to you, especially if you're writing about science, to say, I'm not telling you that you can edit my piece. I'm going to give this to you so you can tell me whether I've got it right.
Right.
That is exactly what I'm increasingly, I'm still speaking in present tense, what I was, because it does seem during the pandemic, I mean, it just seems like I retired yesterday. It was actually the month before the lockdown that I left the editorship. I do think that increasingly good journalists are taking, when they have technical material, when they have stuff that they might get wrong, they submit it to someone to look at, to say, please take a look at this. Now, there are two things, though, that, in fact, one person who does that is the Times Union's great investigative reporter, Brendan Lyons. He's now called managing editor for investigations and state news. And Brendan, with his great investigative work, will often give his source the chunk of material that relates to what they said to him. I've been a victim of this, and I have had stories written about me that were wrong.
Yeah.
It drive me crazy. And almost everybody who's had a story written about them will tell you, no, that's not right. He wasn't terribly consequential, stuff about me, but so I think that's good. Now, there is, however, in a newsroom, it doesn't help with factual material, but it does help with tone and bias. And that is, of course, when you have editors reviewing the content. There are both practices in journalism and procedures that seek to take bias out of the coverage. And that is in the form of an editor saying to a reporter, where did you get this? And are you sure that that's right? I remember when I was a reporter on Long Island, standing next to the city desk, and a young intern came in with a story. And the kid, his dad was the lawyer for the paper, so I think that's how he got hired as an intern. And he said that he had talked to somebody who was reciting something he had seen while at a local mall while he was at TSF. And the editor said, TSF? You mean TSS? And the kid said, no, he said TSF. Well, actually, TSS was an acronym at Times Square stores. That's where it came from. The store was called TSS. But this intern just said, no, TSF, because he didn't want to be wrong. And the editor and I knew he was wrong. And the kid ruined his credibility with the editor by asserting that he knew what he was talking about when we knew he didn't. So the good news is that in good newsrooms, there are editors to review things to try to take tone out of a story. The bad news is there are fewer editors than there used to be. There isn't as much editing, even at great newspapers like the New York Times, which has a newsroom of 1,300 people, but there is a layer of editing that no longer goes on at the Times, because those positions, instead of being for the final read of a story, the copy editor at the third read it would have been, those jobs are now video producers and audio producers, because they've now come into the newsroom, jobs that we never used to have them when all we did was put ink on crushed trees. That was our technology. And so I think that you have a good point there, that there needs to be more of that kind of review. Not that we're going to say to someone, I'm going to let you review this story and tell me that you may tell me that you don't like what it says, but I want you to review the factual data that I'm submitting to you. The problem, part of it is that deadlines, because we work really fast. And but I'm sorry about the problem, because I'm especially dealing with science. Oh man, it's really hard. One of the things you look for when you're hiring, I mean, I've hired so many hundreds of people over the years, and it is really great when you get somebody with a good academic background going into journalism. I don't really tend to hire journalism majors. I would hire people. Actually, one of the best reporters I've ever hired had been a biology teacher in Boston Public Schools before she turned journalism, and she knew how to explain science to kids. And imagine, she was a good journalist. So you look for that. But I hope that the standards are improving so that kind of thing would happen less. But I don't know. There are fewer journalists, and so there isn't as much of that going on. Yeah, Dave. Oh, you need a microphone. Here we go.
There's a bit of biography that you and I share that most of the rest of the group is not aware of. You and I are both minister sons.
Oh, yes.
And my father used to talk about an expectation that he had for what a minister should be, that I suspect your father may have had the same quote in mind about his job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable.
Yes.
And I've always thought that that is in some sense supposed to be the role of reporting as well. That to a certain extent, your job, or the job of reporting, is to not simply feed back what people are already getting, but to point out where they feel comfortable, that they feel like they know everything, and that's not really true.
Yeah.
Or they're feeling completely put upon and discover that in fact what they have actually has some value. And I'm beginning to wonder if that really is people are not wanting or expecting that anymore. I'm thinking particularly of, although this goes back to your reference to Pataki's speech, where he was talking about how wonderful the economy had become. Had your investigation shown that, in fact, by God, he was right all the way across the board,
Yeah.
that you probably would have reported that in the Times Union, but it would have been a one-day story.
Yeah. Wouldn't have been as big.
Whereas the fact that it was not true generated quite a bit more information. And I only very vaguely recall the story at the time, but I'm sure it generated quite a bit more interest in what was going on, because it turns out that a significant part of what he was claiming simply wasn't true.
There's something in what you're saying that is interesting. Two things actually that I think are right, or maybe three. The first is that it's implicit that news is a departure from the norm in a lot of ways. So, 100 planes will take off and land here at Albany International Airport today, and you won't read about any one of them in the Times Union. But if one of those planes belly flops, they're going to write about the plane that crashes. And that might seem unfair to the pilot or the airline or something, but news is a departure from the norm. And the good news is, if you're looking for the silver lining, we live in a society that is largely good. The good things, we go about our lives and things are okay. And so the news is not suffused with what is terrible, but the news is the departure. So it does tend to be afflicting the comfortable. What is problematic is that some journalists get in their head that they are only to be afflicting. I knew a young reporter who told me with pride that her first city editor, that's the local editor who tends to deal with reporters, when she showed up for work, he said, "Come down here, I want to show you something." They walked down the steps out and to the front of the newspaper office. This is in Stamford, Connecticut. And he pointed down the street to the city hall and he said, "You see those people? That's the enemy." And I didn't like that. She thought that was cool. And I said, "No, that's not really true. I don't view our job as being we're not the loyal opposition. Our job is to tell the truth, but they're not the enemy." But I just have to say, apropos our heritage is PKs, we're called preacher's kids, you know.
I told you at rehearsal one time, I don't call us PKs, we're TOs.
TOs. See, are you the origin of that? Yeah, theologian's offspring. It's much cool, you know. I never knew where I got that. That's great. Well, I've adopted it. So, and it's not an accident that I write once a week, you know, and offer on Saturdays, which would be the Jewish Sabbath, my thoughts on the world. I just don't have, my scripture is sort of secular, not sacred. Yes, here, you want to pass that back.
You talk about truth, and I think that's one of the main things we want. And I think that the papers over the years, it seems to me, have done this on the one hand this, on the other hand that kind of what they used to call a fairness doctrine.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that's one thing it's done is create the illusion that life is sort of a horse race to see who's going to win on this. Is it going to be this guy or that guy? And more and more, it seems to me, with the paper's responsibility is to really talk about the truth, so that whoever it is has to be called on it and said, be told, or the readers have to be told, this is not the truth, this is a lie.
Yeah. Boy, I think you're exactly on target. This is one of the big issues in journalism today. And, you know, Dean mentioned that I'm the alumni board chair at Columbia, the world's greatest journalism school. But it is true. And one of the key things that they are talking about there in the faculty and in seminars and in classrooms is the term that they use is both sidism. That journalists have got to get away from both sidism, from the notion that there is objectivity. I was trained to, you know, your journalist has to be objective. Well, you know, there's no such thing as objectivity. We all come from where we come from. We have our point of view. It was who wrote the phrase? The view from nowhere was meant to be how journalism was so neutral that it couldn't tell. And that is increasingly being viewed as sort of an abrogation of our responsibility. And that we do need to, as you're saying, give people the truth, not just he said, she said, and just throw it up in the air and say, oh, well, because if you just do that, then you end up with people don't know what to make, because ordinary citizens don't have the wherewithal to understand. You know, we haven't set foot on the moon, or I haven't, and so I wouldn't, absent good scientists telling me, I wouldn't know what the surface of the moon is. And if someone says it's cheese and someone says no, it's actually, well, some of you here probably know what it is, but anyway, it's rock. I would go with the rock, and journalism ought to tell you that it's rock and not give equal credence to the Holocaust deniers and so on. So, yeah, absolutely. Yes. Here.
What do you see as, What do you see as the future for musical reviewers and
Oh.
reviews?
Oh, thank you. We're going to talk about music. The future for musical reviewers and reviews. Well, here's the problem with reviews of books and music and any of the arts. Well, there are a couple of problems. First, to have somebody who's really qualified to do the job is difficult to find, especially in a smaller publication. Like the Times Union is we have the Times Union music critic, Jody Dalton. Actually, he worked for the Times Union because my wife ran into him on an Amtrak train coming up from New York 20 years ago. And he'd been the head of a record label down in New York. And she said, "What do you want to do?" And he said, "Well, I'm moving up and I hope to become a journalist." And she said, "Well, isn't that interesting? My husband is a journalist." Anyway, the difficulty is that it's hard to find people to do the good work. Actually, there are a lot of unemployed journalists now, arts experts who could do it, but there isn't as much money to pay them to do it. And because events tend to be often one time, a concert is here at 3:00 on Sunday, and when you read a review of it, it's over. It's probably better for the organization to do a preview rather than a review. And if a journalist can write about what's coming, well, this is something that the organization would probably prefer rather than a review. And the other problem with reviews is that if you're in a community where there's only one news organization, a reviewer takes on extraordinary influence. Some years ago, shortly after I became the editor of the paper, Maggie Manson-Lee Cale, the producing artistic director of Capitol Rep, asked if we could sit down and have lunch. And she brought with her a fat folder of reviews that were all negative, that were really quite nasty, some of them. And her perspective was that the Times Union critic was not only holding her theater to a standard that was impossible, but had just a different vision of what she ought to be producing. Cap Rep produces theater throughout the year. It doesn't take a summer off. There isn't a season. But in the summertime, people prefer lighter fare. And so she would program a rather nice, fun piece. What's that thing that has plaid in the name? Very right. And the critic didn't like that. And she said, "Who are you to tell me what my theater ought to be programming?" And I thought she had a good point. I think the Times Union became more fair in its assessment of theater as a result. And I was frustrated. I've been singing with Albany Pro Musica for 22 seasons. And during those years that I was the editor of the paper, I always told first David Janauer and then Jose Daniel Flores Caravaggio, our current artistic director, I can't do anything for you because I am engaged in this. So you have to talk to the managing editor, not to me. And I remember sitting in my office one day with a glass box in the middle of the newsroom, and here comes David Janauer across the newsroom with the managing editor going to complain about the Times Union coverage. And it wasn't my role, I thought, because I was biased in favor of Albany Pro Musica. So I had to stay out of it. So I think that there's, I should also point out my wife's second book was, my wife has 4 books published, and the second one, the only negative review she got was in the Times Union. And it was because they went out, they didn't want to have anybody who knew me. And they went out and found somebody. And I think this person thought that she should be tough with the editor's wife. And that doesn't seem fair. But that's my biased point of view. Maybe she didn't deserve a good review. I don't know. I thought it was a great book. Anyway.
Another statement they back.
Hey.
I don't have any modern questions to ask, just a couple of promos. Number one, do journalists take a journalist view for anyone who refuses to be interviewed on a particular subject? Don't I have a right to decline to be interviewed? A journalist told me once that because I was declining, he thought I had something to hide on the particular subject. That's the first question.
Yeah.
And the second kind of question is this: where do you journalists stand in the polls? How popular are you these days? You used to be low down in the polls, around the respectability of the public and private sector.
Yes.
That's one question.
Thank you. No, thank you. I appreciate that. I doubt that anybody has accused you of being naive, Professor. It's I wouldn't. It's one of my favorite people in the faculty here, so I have to. Where we stand low in the polls. We are. We are actually. The question is often asked of certain professions, and journalists do stand above used automobile dealers and barely above members of Congress. We are below military, bank officials, salespeople. Journalists are really pretty far down in the public trust surveys. Pew Charitable Foundation, Pew Trust does this research. So that's bad news for me. As to not answering questions, I think a private citizen has every right to say, I don't want to talk. For whatever reason, I just don't choose to talk to you. When a person is a public official, I have a different feeling about it. My representative in Congress, as of this last redistricting, is Elise Stefanik. And she doesn't talk to reporters anymore. Or any of them, except, well, she'll talk to these right-wing organizations that don't do real journalism. They're, like Newsmax and
OAN.
yeah, OAN, thank you, One American News. And she talks to them, but she doesn't talk to like the Glens Falls Post-Star or the Lake Placid News, Adirondack Enterprise, the Times Union, of course, Northeast Public Radio, which is licensed at St. Lawrence University. And so I think that a public official has an obligation to be accessible and to answer questions. Private citizens, no. And so, but I think a lot of journalists get kind of haughty about this and say, well, you got to talk to me because I am a journalist, and that's not good behavior. Journalism is, you got to have humility. You have to have the humility to be able to hear the story. You have to have the confidence to be able to go out and get the story, and the confidence to say, this is the truth, and put it together. But the humility of being able to hear what people are saying to you, I mean, that's just good character anyway, but it's also kind of fundamental to journalism. And there's a loss of that is reflected, I think, in that kind of answer. There's over here behind.
My wife, my granddaughter, your daughter, and Elise Stefanik are all Albany Academy for Girls graduates. Can you explain that?
Well, My daughter went through 8th grade. She then went to Emma Willard for the last 4 years. But I cannot explain that. I can't, I mean, at least, no. I'm very sorry about that. It's embarrassing. You know, that I think she was trained better there. I mean, I think that children learn civics education in those days. It was to be engaged.
It was a lot different until
Yeah,
recently.
yeah, she started as a moderate and she was friendly anyway. Sir,
One of the multiple papers to which I subscribe is the Altamont Enterprise.
oh,
It's a very small,
Yeah.
really local paper.
yeah,
And I don't have any real insight into their business model or anything, but they seem to be able to make a go of it. And you're certainly familiar with a number of these
yeah.
smaller papers, and you were pointing out how many of them have completely died. Do you have any insight into why some of these have been able to survive, like the Altamont Enterprise?
Right.
They're supported by the county. They produce them. They publish a lot of the county.
Yeah.
There's
Required.
Yeah, that's true. Legal advertising helps to support them.
Actually, the whole second half of the paper is nothing but legal ads.
Yeah, that really helps. It really does. And that one of the, part of the history of the Times Union is during the Corning era, when the Democratic machine was powerful in this community, the Times Union really ticked off Mayor Corning. And the result was they withdrew the legal advertising from the Times Union and put it into the diocesan newspaper, the Evangelist, right? Which was, good for the church, but not so much for the Times Union. And thinking, well, we'll show them. The Times Union about that time really needed to expand and needed some little corner of property at where it was located down. What's the name of that down in the gulch there across from where Yono's is? What's that called? Sheridan Hollow. Thank you. The Times Union was down on Sheridan Avenue at that time, and the city of Albany also in its wisdom decided not to do any favors for the Times Union, and did not realize the Times Union had bought this property out in Colony. And that's why the Times Union is located out in Colony. It was a wonderful thing because it put the Times Union in the geographic center of the capital region and encouraged it, because at the time of that move, the Times Union was about the same size as the Gazette and the Record. And that's one of the things that turned the Times Union into the regional newspaper instead of just one of the local papers in town. But I think that's one of the reasons that the Enterprise has some help. Plus, I would love to think that it's because it's a good little weekly,
Yeah.
I think they do a good job for their community. I look at newspapers all over the country these days, small dailies, because I include some little local news vignettes at the bottom of the Upstate American, my weekly report. And there is an awful lot of slipshod journalism going on in these little communities where I think probably, if the community has 2 or 3 reporters and they have to do everything, they just don't have time to do the extra bit of reporting to give depth to their stories. It's really too bad. Yes, sir.
I think the Times Union's done a much better job in recent years of local reporting. They have a lot more. One of the things is they have frequently picked up a story that the Enterprise had first. And they went and picked, did their own story. with it.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the food chain of journalism. 60 Minutes doesn't do very much original reporting for CBS News. They will drop into Great Falls, Montana and Dubuque, Iowa, and all these places where there's been some local reporting, and they'll then heighten an ad as the folks in theater would have you do, and they bring you then this reporting. And the Times Union, same thing. But some of that is greatly frustrating. The Times Union in my time did this big investigation of NXIVM, the cult, and no public officials took action on it. I called the Attorney General, to tell you the truth. I called Eric Schneiderman, who was then the Attorney General, and said, would you please look at this investigative series that we did? Just take a look. And he called me back and said, I can't do anything with this. It wasn't until that story got picked up in the New York Times that the officials responded. And that's why those people went to prison, because it got, and I know that people say, well, the Times Union picks up stuff. That's true, from the little local papers. But anyway, it's, but not always. But usually if you're in a bigger newsroom, you can do a better job and dig a little bit further in depth.
Is there any future to nonprofit?
Yes, future to nonprofit news. And I hope there is future to nonprofit news. There are now several hundred nonprofit local news organizations around the country. I'm on the board of one, the Adirondack Explorer is a wonderful magazine and 2 websites, and they also publish some guides to the Adirondacks. I think it's the best newsroom. Well, North Country Public Radio is pretty great too, but the Explorer is a great newsroom, and it's not for profit. But these not for profits, 2 things about them. First, they exist thanks to the generosity of donors and foundations generally, and to the tax code support. And then second, they only exist where there is enough of an audience to sustain them. So it's really hard to get into some of these little communities that don't have any coverage anymore. If you go down, like in Greene County, just south of us here, it's really hard to do good journalism in Greene County because there just isn't enough commerce to sustain, to provide advertising revenue. But there also aren't enough people to have a base that any not-for-profit is going to go in there. So the little places still have some trouble. But I think a big part of the solution to the journalism problem is in not-for-profit news. I really think that's a great idea. You'll still have these big for-profit enterprises. The New York Times is richer than ever, but they have 9 million digital subscribers. So they can, they can afford to do that. They can make money. But so I think not-for-profit news is a great solution in most of these places. Don't tell George Hurst I said that. Yes. Yes.
What can we do here? What can we do here in this room to help you get a Pulitzer Prize?
Oh, my Pulitzer Prize. Thank you. Well, the Pulitzer, it's very kind. Thank you, Professor Slade. The Pulitzer Prize is awarded for contemporaneous work. So it has to be the Pulitzer jurors are probably meeting about now, in fact, February, that's awarded in April for the work of the preceding year. And so my time is up. I'm not a newspaper editor anymore. I don't think I can qualify. I'm not doing the kind of work that the Pulitzer jurors pay attention to. One of the interesting sidelights, when I was an investigative reporter, I did a piece that was nominated, and it was a pretty good piece, and it went through a couple rounds of judging for the Pulitzers. The problem was, if you publish at the end of the year, the Pulitzer jurors don't see much impact from your work because it takes months of it. And my great investigative project was published the first 3 days of December, first 4 days of December or something, in whatever year that was, sometime in the 80s. And so I didn't win the Pulitzer when I had my best shot. And so that's a kind of a failing of the Pulitzer Prize, but what can you do? We should. From your lips too. Anyway, that's more time than I intended to take. Thank you very much for your wonderful audience.
Thank you, Rex. That was
George, but
really
that
appreciate
is
you sharing
actually
with us.
Essex, New York. No, I think across the river. Okay. No, why did I?
Had a lot of good political quotes there.
See y'all at 27.
I did know you're on.
I've got to go. So much.
Well, nice to see you.
Gotta stop. Yeah. Carol. Or something.
No, won't let you get out.
Oh, well.